and welcome. Today we're going to turn a leather burnisher from this piece of ash. I'm going to make this leather burnisher about 130mm, give or take 10mm. It doesn't need to be particularly accurate, which is great, and it's really good practice for things like a honey dipper because you have all of those recesses. The tools I'm going to be using to do this will be a round scraper, a skew maybe, I don't know yet, and this V-cut chisel. I'll be using a V-cut chisel to do most of the little notches, as it's got a very fine blade, so it's very good for getting into all of those gaps. And then I'm going to finish it with some food safe finish and cellulose sanding sealer. I then marked where I needed to cut on the piece of ash and moved on to cutting using my tenon saw. I then used my block plane to round over the edges to create an octagonal blank. This just really speeds up the process of turning, as you don't have a square blank to turn. Instead you have an octagonal blank, which is much quicker. I then marked the centres and mounted it on the lathe. I then started the turning process. I used my round scraper to turn this blank from being octagonal to a nice round shape. I then started shaping the handle section. I wanted this to fit comfortably in my hand, but also be really easy to use, so I went for quite a nice tapering handle section. I then sanded with 120 grit and 180 grit, but I quickly realised the handle section needed to be much thinner for a more comfortable fit in the hand. So with most of the bulk of the turning done, we're now going to move on to shaping the burnisher and getting the handle section really nice and comfortable, and then we're going to move on to adding the notches. I then started to turn the coves on the top section of the leather burnisher. These are where the leather will actually be burnished. There's not an exact science to how deep these need to be, so I just had a bit of fun playing around with the shape and sanded all the way from 120 grit up to 180 grit, refining some sections where necessary to create the coves to be slightly deeper or slightly thinner in places. This project did require quite a lot of sanding to create a really nice finish. Now it's time for the exciting bit, which is adding some cellulose sanding sealer. I'm going to be using Chestnut products to do this, and then some food safe finish, which I'll also be using Chestnut products for. You could of course do a wax finish, but for something like a burnisher I feel like a food safe finish would be better, as then you can add wax if you want to burnish it with wax. It doesn't really matter then. So let's move on to applying the finishes now. So we're going to move on to adding the cellulose sanding sealer now. As I said, I'll be using Chestnut products to do this, but you could use any other brand. I just prefer using Chestnut products. So we're going to start with a nice healthy amount of sanding sealer, and we're just going to work it into the whole of this burnisher. Now I'll probably add 3 or 4 coats of food safe finish, but I'll probably only add 1 coat of sealer. Now if you want you could thin this down, but I don't particularly see the need to do that, as it's already thin enough to go onto here. So we're now going to turn the lathe on and give it a buff. So with the cellulose sanding sealer applied, we're now going to move on to adding the food safe finish. I think we'll do about 2 or 3 coats of this. So we're going to add another coat of food safe finish now. I start with the lathe on and just buff this in, and then buff it off with a clean cloth. Just working it into all of those recesses. Build up a nice amount of it. Let that sit for a couple of minutes and then buff it off afterwards. So we're going to move on to buffing it now. It's still quite oily, so that means that there's a bit of oil sitting on the surface, so we'll just use a rag to get most of that off. So we're just moving it along, just taking off the top layer of oil, because we don't want it to feel all oily and horrible to hold. If you left it for long enough it might soak in, but to be honest the likelihood of that happening is fairly slim. So just move it all around the burnisher, just giving a nice buff to it, and then that's pretty much it, and then we'll just cut it off in about 10 minutes time. So we're now going to part it off. I then cut the blank free from the lathe. So now we're going to move on to sanding up the burnisher. It looks pretty good, I'm happy with it. We just need to sort this end and this end out now, so that it all looks nice and feels nice. I then rounded over the edges of the burnisher on my belt sander. Here are some photos of how the project turned out. I'm really happy with it, and I think it will make an excellent use for leatherworking. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video.